I'm S.J. Rozan. I have written with Mr. Ma 20 books, 19 of them published. One of them will come out sooner or later. I've been in the mystery world for since the uh, early days of the dinosaurs, and I've won a bunch of awards. I have a series that stars a Chinese American private eye, which is part of how John got to me. John?
I'm John Nee. I'm a pop culture guy. I've worked in comics, video games for 35 years. I started Wildstorm Productions with a guy named Jim Lee. We moved that to DC Comics. I stayed there for a good long while. Started a board game company called Cryptozoic. Uh, Took a sabbatical from that to run Marvel Comics. It was a big, fun thing to do. And this is my first work of fiction that I've co-authored in my career. So very excited to talk about the murder of Mr. Ma.
I would describe it as a crime novel starring two Chinese investigators set in London in 1924 with a lot of kung fu.
Um, I would describe it as the story of China in the 20th century with the information being conveyed between two sleuths in 1920s London with a lot of kung fu, but it's really meant on a larger level to touch on the significant events of China in the past 100 years.
That would be the book as the beginning of the series, which will go
Yeah.
through the history of modern China with a lot of kung fu. From my point of view, the genesis was in the middle of COVID. The agent, Josh Getzler, called me and he said, I just talked to this guy. He's a friend of Alex's. And we talked for about an hour and a half. And I think he's got a project that would be perfect for you. I also think he might be nuts. And I said, he said, will you talk to him? And I was talking to the walls. I mean, this is 3 months into COVID. We have nothing going on. Of course I'll talk to him. So John and I talked for an hour and a half, and I got back to Josh and I said, you know what? I think you're right on both counts. This is a great project. I would love to do this project. And he's nuts. And I have kept both those ideas going ever since. And I love the kind of nuts John is, so it works for me. I came in when the outline was already written, which I loved. I don't outline when I write my Lydia Chin, Bill Smith books. And every morning I get up with, you know, an anxiety, a lump of anxiety in my stomach. Oh my God, what am I going to do today? To have an outline was such a privilege. And this outline was so well shaped. So the first thing I did when we finally decided we were going to collaborate was I wrote a chapter in Lao She's voice and I sent it to John. And I thought, if he likes this, we're good. And if he doesn't, it's all over because this is now the voice that I have. And there's nothing I can do about it. So I sent it to John and take it away, John.
Well, so because you do bring up an interesting point, and having had the jobs that I've had, this is very much how stories are crafted at both DC Comics and Marvel Comics. And so uh, we would, have a room filled with 35 people, and we would all sit around and talk about stuff that was going to happen. And then there would, as SJ describes it, be a 16-page, document that describes what was going to happen as a result of those meetings. And so this is something that's very, very common in comics. It's not as common in prose fiction because it's not done in a collaborative manner. And so I would describe SJ and I as like chocolate and peanut butter, where she certainly has made me a better storyteller, and also, and we can get into this in some future thing, but a less cruel narrator. So,
John,
but
John described this before as this white lady came in and made me on Chinese half the manuscript. Not really, but
Right. Yeah. Direnji was a real life person in the Tang Dynasty, and he is described by people in the West who do know him, and very few people do, as the Sherlock Holmes of China. Similarly, Lao She is described today by people as the Charles Dickens of China. And with the exception of some, Direnji is incredibly popular, and there have been tons of films and TV shows and novels in the West, novels in the East about this character for hundreds of years now. And there's a really fabulous set of kung fu movies by Sweetheart that really introduced Direnji to the West in a more contemporary way than previously. And Lao She was a revolutionary who loved China and had really wanted to use art and fiction as a way of bringing China into modern society. And it, for me, these guys being so completely forgotten is a tragedy of history. And the problem is that, and I don't want you to not read Mr. Ma, but what I really would like is for you to go read a 1,000-page book on the history of China, but no one's going to do that. And so my goal for this was to bring these people who lived in real life to the forefront of awareness in culture. And it felt like the narrative of a mystery would be a very entertaining way to do that. And if I could think of something that would be very similar, and by no means would I say that we are Umberto Eco, but very much in the vein of Name of the Rose.
I can't say it any better. Name of the Rose. There you go. No, I Direnji is the one thing I think people might need to know is that he is famed. He was a judge, but in his day, judges did their own investigations, and he was famed as an investigator, and he never couldn't solve a case, and he was extremely logical and rational, and that was his. He would just go at it. Also, people who know the character through either the Van Gulik books or the movies or whatever, will know that he had a group of people who worked with him, and so we've built that group through the first couple books. So he will have his posse now. So
And
that is
and many of the, while there's a genre of fiction in China called wuxia, which is kung fu fiction. While there is kung fu in the sort of more traditional Judge Dee stories, we really elected to amp it up in The Murder of Mr. Ma and take a wuxia approach to the fighting. And we'll talk about that in a little bit, because we ended up taking a pretty unique approach that really truly amplified the action. So while this feels very cozy in many ways, it's got a lot of heavy action. So, and SJ and I talked about this earlier, where um, the difference between how Judge Dee would tell a story versus how Lao She would tell the story. Judge Dee would tell the story in a third of a page, describing all of the highlights of the investigation, and then in the end, whatever the prosecution of the sentence would be. And so that would be this would be someone murdered Mr. Ma and we caught him. That's the Judge Dee version of this. The Lao She version of this is, all of the details of the investigation. And so I think in that way, mapping, Watson as the narrator versus Holmes, who's this, bordering on mythical being, well, truly mythical being, but it just the the Ubermensch in the most amazing way, because Judge D can do it all. He can fight, he can cook, he can dance, he can do magic tricks, he can, you know, do it all. And that's from that perspective not super interesting. But it's almost like superhero fiction where I come from, where we're witnessing these people doing these amazing things.
Yeah, that was important. That Lao She, as a narrator, is a man who finds Dee amazing. And it comes actually through the book. There are places where Lao She says, I'm going to tell you now the story as Dee told it to me, but he told it to me a lot later because he really wasn't interested in telling it because he had things to do, like go out and catch the bad guys, and I had to force him to tell me what actually went on. And that puts the reader in the position of Lao She watching Dee do all these things and not be like Watson, not be quite as sharp. He's like Watson, not a stupid man, but he's not quite as sharp as Dee. He's not two steps ahead of the bad guys, and so he narrates that for the reader to introduce the reader to this superhuman character, who is not actually superhuman. He's just Sherlock Holmesian, like beyond reality. Well, once upon a time, no, John and I had always wanted the fight scenes. John had written these places where these scenes existed. Five guys go at it, but neither of us is a kung fu expert, and neither of us could choreograph these scenes. And so we decided we would get a kung fu fight choreographer. But John started looking into it in Hollywood, and these guys are like $10,000, $15,000 a day, and that was not in the budget. So at that point where we found that out, and we didn't know what to do, I was at a birthday party for a friend of mine, and I was talking to another friend and telling him, because he knew about the book and he asked how the book was going. And I said, well, it's going great, except that we have this big problem because we need a kung fu expert. We don't have a kung fu expert. And what are we going to do without a kung fu expert? And another friend tapped me on the shoulder and he said, listen, I don't mean to be eavesdropping, but I used to study kung fu with a guy named Master Ko, Sifu Ko, down in Chinatown. And I bet he would do this for you. So Henry introduced us to Sifu Ko, who is exactly the guy we needed. Well, the upcoming book, there's a second book, which is also set in London a number of months later and involves a larger, more politically direct group of Chinese people. Um, but that's all I'll say about that. John, you want to go into the giant
Well,
tree?
and then I come from comics, so we build these very, layered, long-term stories. So for me, we're in 1924, and I do have stories that would carry um, D through the 1990s in my not written down, and the this isn't a spoiler to any of the books, but it is a spoiler to people going on Wikipedia and checking out Lachey, is that he was murdered during the Cultural Revolution in 1966, and the history of his you know support for China, then being purged by China, and then being returned, and he's described as being posthumously recuperated uh, by the Chinese government, and that certainly we have Di and Lao stories going through the rest of Lao She's life.
So The Murder of Mr. Ma comes out in April 2024 from Soho Crime. Thank you for visiting our Day of Dialogue virtual booth.